At this rate, you'll never get married, May Whitfield." Jack Calloway said it with a grin meant as a joke, the kind of teasing that had become the language between them over months of arguments about chickens and fence lines and who exactly owned the water that ran between their properties. May didn't blush. She didn't look away. She set down her basket, turned to face him with those steady brown eyes, and said it like she'd been waiting all her life to say exactly this. "Only when you propose to me, Jack." The harvest hall went quiet, and Jack Calloway had absolutely nothing left to say. If this story already has your attention, subscribe to this channel, follow along to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The chicken came back on a Tuesday. Jack Calloway discovered it the way he discovered most problems in his life, by nearly stepping on it. He was crossing his east field before dawn, coffee still warm in his hand, head full of the day's work, when something white and indignant exploded out of the grass at his feet and screamed at him like he was the one trespassing. He looked down. The chicken looked up. It was a Rhode Island red, except it was white, which meant it belonged to exactly one person in all of Ridgeback, Montana, and that person was not him. Jack picked up his hat, which had flown off when he stumbled, set it back on his head, and stood there for a long moment, looking at the bird. The bird scratched at his soil. It found something interesting near the base of his fence post and began excavating with the focused determination of a creature that had no intention of leaving. "Not again," Jack said. The chicken ignored him. He caught it, which took longer than he would ever admit to another living soul, and carried it back to the fence line that separated his property from the Whitfield land. He set it down on May's side, took 2 steps back, and watched it turn around, squeeze through a gap he had not previously noticed in the bottom rail, and return to his field. Jack stared at it. The chicken stared back. Then it walked past him and went back to digging up his fence post. He knocked on May Whitfield's door at 7 in the morning, which he understood was not ideal, but which he felt the circumstances justified. She answered on the second knock. She was already up. May was always already up, and she had flour on her hands and a dish towel over her shoulder, and the look on her face when she saw him standing on her porch holding her chicken was not apologetic. It was amused. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "your chicken is in my east field. I can see that. I've brought it back. And yet you're holding it, which suggests it didn't stay where you put it." Jack looked at the chicken in his hands. The chicken had gone entirely placid the moment May appeared, as if it had been perfectly well behaved this entire morning, and Jack was simply making things up. "It came back through the fence," Jack said. "There's a gap in the lower rail, about 3 boards down from the corner post. I'll take a look at it." "I'd appreciate that. It's been in my east field 3 mornings running." May took the chicken from him with the ease of someone who had handled livestock her whole life. She tucked it under one arm, and the bird settled there like it had arrived home from a long journey. "Has it done any damage?" she asked. "To my dignity, possibly." May's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, something more controlled than that, like she was deciding whether he'd earned the full version yet. "I'll fix the fence this afternoon," she said. "I'm sorry for the trouble." "Thank you." He turned to go. "Mr. Calloway." He stopped. "You've got a gap in your own fence line, you know, about 20 feet north of mine. Your cattle have been grazing the south corner of my pasture grass twice this week." Jack turned back slowly. May was watching him with those calm brown eyes. The chicken was watching him too. "I wasn't aware of that," he said. "Now you are." He stood there for 1 beat, 2 beats recalibrating. "I'll fix it today," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. Have a good morning." She closed the door. The chicken, he noticed, did not reappear in his field that day, but he thought about the conversation for the rest of the week. May Whitfield had been running her property alone for 3 years. This was the first thing most people in Ridgeback knew about her, and they said it in 2 different ways, depending on who was doing the talking. The men in town said it with something like pity or else with the particular brand of skepticism reserved for women attempting things men believed required a man. The women in town said it with a different kind of weight, a recognition, a quiet solidarity. May herself never said it at all. She simply ran her property. She had inherited it when her father died in the winter of 1878, leaving her 140 acres. A modest herd of cattle, a workable vegetable patch, and a ranch hand named Orville, who was 63 years old and had bad knees, but a good heart, and showed up every morning regardless of weather or ailment or the state of his knees. Her mother had passed 2 years before her father. She had no brothers. The nearest family was a cousin in Helena, who had offered to take her in, and whom May had thanked very sincerely and then never contacted again. She was 25 when she took over the property. She had made mistakes. Every rancher made mistakes, and anyone who told you otherwise was either lying or hadn't ranched long enough. But she had learned from each one, absorbed the cost, adjusted her approach, and kept going. By the time she turned 28, her cattle were healthy, her pastures were better managed than they had been under her father, and Orville had stopped offering her unsolicited advice, which she took as the highest possible compliment from a man who had been ranching since before she was born. She had also made an enemy of the man who owned the land to her east. That was perhaps too strong a word. Jack Calloway wasn't her enemy. He was her complication. The fence was the original issue. It had been improperly surveyed when the Calloway land was originally recorded, and the boundary markers had shifted over the years, or rather one of them had, and nobody had agreed on which one was correct. And the dispute had been low-grade and unresolved since before Jack inherited the property from his father, and May inherited hers. When they were children, their fathers had argued about it at town meetings and said nothing to each other's faces, which was how men of that generation handled disagreements they couldn't win outright. May and Jack had grown up aware of the tension. The way children are always aware of the tensions adults pretend to keep hidden completely and without anyone ever saying a word. Now they were the adults, and they were handling it differently. The water rights were the second issue. There was a creek, Calloway Creek, which Jack's grandfather had named, and which May's family had always called Miller Creek after the family that had actually homesteaded this land before anyone named Calloway arrived. And this disagreement about the name was in some ways more heated than the disagreement about the water itself. The creek ran along the northwest edge of the shared fence line, and both properties had claims to it, and those claims had never been formally arbitrated. Jack had never tried to restrict May's access. She had never tried to restrict his. But both of them knew the other could legally, and that knowledge sat between them like a card neither player had played yet. The chicken was simply the most recent chapter in a very long story. He came back 3 days later with a written account of the fence survey from the county clerk's office. He had ridden into town specifically for this purpose, which he did not mention, and he knocked on May's door with the document under his arm and the careful expression of a man who has prepared a case and expects to win it. May read the document in the doorway. She read it slowly and without expression. Then she handed it back to him. "This survey is from 1872, she said. "Yes, that's 9 years ago. The property lines don't change. The survey markers do." She disappeared inside for a moment and came back with a document of her own, a map hand-drawn but precise with notations in 2 different inks. "Orville found this in my father's papers last fall. It's a resurvey from 1876, commissioned by my father and a surveyor out of Billings. The eastern boundary is marked here." She pointed to a line on the map, which puts the disputed corner post inside my property line, not yours. Jack looked at the map. He looked at it for a long time. "I've never seen this document," he said. "My father never shared it with yours. I assume he intended to, and then they stopped speaking, and then..." She paused, and then time passed. Jack lowered the map. He looked at her directly. "If this survey is accurate, you have a legitimate claim to about 8 feet of fence line that I've been treating as mine." "Yes." "And you haven't brought this to the county clerk?" "No." "Why not?" May folded her arms, not defensively thoughtfully like she was choosing her words the way a person chooses tools, selecting the right one for the job. Because I'm not interested in fighting over 8 feet of fence line, Mr. Calloway. I'm interested in knowing where the correct boundary is. Those are not the same thing. Jack looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "No, I suppose they're not. If you'd like to bring both documents to the clerk's office and have them reconciled properly, I'm willing to do that. If the 1876 survey holds, I'll expect acknowledgement of the boundary. If it doesn't, I'll accept the 1872 markers and we'll be done with it." That's a reasonable position. I generally try to be reasonable, May said. It saves time. Jack almost smiled. He caught it just before it showed. "I'll arrange the appointment," he said. "Next week, if that works." "Next week is fine." He left. He rode the boundary fence on his way home, looking at the markers with different eyes, and he thought about May Whitfield, saying, "Those are not the same thing," in that clear, unhurried voice, and he could not entirely identify what it was the thought produced in him. Not irritation, something more interesting than that. The county clerk's office smelled of ink and old paper, and the particular kind of institutional patience that accumulates in government buildings over decades. The clerk, a man named Horace Blunt, who had been doing this work since territorial days, and had the air of someone who had seen every variety of neighbor dispute Montana had to offer, reviewed both documents without any visible sign of preference. He measured, he cross-referenced, he made notes in the margins of both documents in pencil, the way a man might annotate a text he intended to study further. Jack sat on one side of the table. May sat on the other. They didn't look at each other for most of the review, both watching Horace with the focused neutrality of people who had agreed to be calm about this, and were holding to that agreement through sheer force of will. "The 1876 survey is more accurate," Horace said finally, without preamble. "The markers are better documented, and the measurement methodology is consistent with records from that period. The 1872 survey has 3 errors that I can identify, 2 in measurement and 1 in the original reference point, which was tied to a creek position that shifted after the flood of 1873. Jack heard May exhale very quietly beside him. "How much of the fence line is affected?" Jack asked. 11 feet 2 inches, Horace said. "The corner post on the east side is inside Miss Whitfield's legal boundary. The fence line should run approximately 11 feet west of its current position to be accurate." 11 feet. May said nothing. She was looking at the map on the table with the focused attention of someone carefully not showing what she was feeling. "Is there a formal record of this finding?" Jack asked. "I'll file the notation today," Horace said. "You'll both receive copies. The boundary correction is on record as of this date." Jack stood. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him, settled it on his head, and looked at May across the table. "I apologize," he said, "for 9 years of improperly placed fence line." May looked up at him. Whatever she had been feeling was gone from her face, now replaced by something quieter and harder to read. "You didn't place it," she said. "Neither did I." "No, but I benefit from correcting it more than you do, because I was wrong about where the boundary was, and now I know. That's worth something." May studied him for a moment. "It is," she said finally. "Thank you." They walked out of the clerk's office together into the late morning cold, and stood on the step for a moment before they would turn in opposite directions toward their horses. "I'll move the fence posts myself," Jack said. "It doesn't need to cost you anything." "I wasn't going to ask you to do that." "I know you weren't. I'm offering." May looked at him. The wind was sharp off the mountains, and she had her coat buttoned to the collar, and she was looking at him with those calm brown eyes that didn't give much away, and everything away at the same time, if you were paying attention. "All right," she said. "I'll provide the posts." "You don't have to. I have extra posts from the spring repairs. It would be wasteful not to use them." She picked up her reins. "I'll have Orville drop them at the east corner." Jack watched her mount up with the easy efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. She settled into the saddle and looked down at him. "Wednesday," she said. "Wednesday?" He agreed. She turned her horse and rode. Jack stood there a moment longer than he needed to before he went to find his own. On Wednesday, he moved the fence posts. She brought the extra posts as promised, and Orville dropped them at the corner, and then made himself scarce with the dignified tact of a ranch hand who understood when his presence was not required. May worked alongside Jack for 2 hours, handing posts, steadying rails, checking measurements. She was precise and efficient, and she did not make conversation for the sake of it, which Jack found refreshing rather than cold. When they spoke, it was about the work. When they didn't speak, the silence was comfortable rather than strained. They were finishing the last section when May straightened up and looked at the new fence line. "It's strange," she said, "having the right thing finally where it belongs." Jack drove the last nail. He stepped back and looked at the line beside her. "Does it change anything?" "Practically. A little. There's a better drainage angle on my side now, and the post line doesn't cross the spring runoff path." She paused. "It was small things over many years. That's how it usually is." Jack looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The wrong boundary didn't ruin either of us, but it kept things slightly off just enough to cause friction. 11 feet in the wrong direction for 9 years. She picked up her gloves from the ground. "I think most problems are like that, actually. Not catastrophic. Just persistently slightly wrong." Jack didn't have an answer for that. He thought about it the whole ride home. He thought about it for longer than that. The chicken appeared in his east field again on the following Saturday. Jack looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee, turned around, and went back inside. He left it there. He told himself he was busy. That afternoon, he found May at his gate. She had the chicken under one arm and a coil of fresh wire in the other hand. "There's still a gap," she said. "I'm sorry, I thought I'd caught it." "It's all right." "It's not. It's been crossing onto your property for 3 weeks. I'll patch it properly this time." She held up the wire. "If you don't mind me working on your fence." "I don't mind." "Thank you." "May." The name came out before he decided to use it. He saw her register it, a slight pause, a moment of recalibration, but her expression didn't change. "You don't have to apologize every time. The chicken's a nuisance, but it's not." He stopped. "I've stopped being bothered by it." May looked at him carefully. "Why?" Jack considered the question with more honesty than he expected. "Because the first time it showed up," he said slowly, "I was irritated. The second time I was annoyed. By the third time—" He paused. "I don't know. I was less annoyed than I was just glad to have a reason to come over here." The silence that followed was different from the silences they'd shared while working the fence. That had been easy, uncomplicated quiet. This one had weight to it. May's grip on the wire coil shifted. "That's a forthright thing to say," she said finally. "I'm a forthright kind of man." "You are," she agreed. Something moved behind her eyes. "Jack." His name in her voice. He filed that away somewhere. "I'll fix the fence," she said. "But the next time that chicken comes over, you're welcome to keep her for a day or two. She's actually very good at turning soil." Jack laughed. It was an involuntary thing, genuine, and a little surprised, and May's almost smile became the full version for just a moment before she reined it back in. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. She fixed the fence. He brought her a cup of coffee while she worked. She accepted it without comment, and they stood together in the cold afternoon air until the gap was sealed, and then she went home, and he watched her go, and he stood there at his own gate long after she was out of sight. The chicken, for what it was worth, stayed on its own side of the fence for exactly 11 days. When it came back on the 12th, Jack found himself smiling before he even picked it up. He carried it to the fence line himself, and instead of setting it down on her side, he simply stood there holding it, looking across the Whitfield land, hoping without quite admitting it that May would come out of the house. She did. She always seemed to know. She came across the field toward him with her hands in her coat pockets and her hair loose under her hat, and the low winter light came off the mountains behind her, and Jack Calloway stood at his fence line holding a ridiculous white chicken and thought something that he was not yet ready to put into words. Not yet. But soon. The chicken was not the end of it. If anything, it was the beginning. January came in hard and cold, the kind of cold that made the ground ring like iron underfoot, and turned breath into something visible and brief. Jack had fully intended to spend the winter months keeping a respectful distance, being a good neighbor fixing his own problems, not inventing reasons to cross the fence line. He had given himself this instruction with complete sincerity on the last day of December, standing at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee watching snow settle across the Whitfield pasture in the blue pre-dawn light. He lasted 6 days. The reason this time was not a chicken. It was water. The creek, Callaway Creek, or Miller Creek, depending on whose grandfather you asked, had partially frozen over in the cold snap, and the freeze had pushed a section of the bank in a direction that was redirecting runoff toward the low corner of Jack's north pasture. He'd gone out to check the ice on a Monday morning and found the situation deteriorating faster than he expected, and he'd spent an hour breaking up ice dams with a shovel before he realized that the real problem was upstream on the shared boundary where a natural debris blockage had formed just on May's side of the line. He stood at the bank and looked at the blockage. He looked at May's side. He looked back at his pasture, which was absorbing water it didn't need. Then he went and knocked on her door. "There's a debris blockage on your side of the creek line," he said when she answered. "It's redirecting runoff onto my north pasture. I can clear it from my side if you'll give me access, or you can clear it from yours, or we can both." "I'll clear it," May said. She already had her coat on. She had been on her way out the door, he realized. "I saw it yesterday. I was planning to deal with it this morning." Jack blinked. "You already knew." "I was going to send Orville over to let you know before I started. I didn't want you to see me working on the bank and think I was trying to redirect flow onto your land deliberately." He hadn't even considered that. The fact that she had thought ahead to how it might look, had planned to communicate before acting, said something about how carefully she operated, how much thought she gave to the space between their properties, not just as ground, but as relationship. "I'll help," Jack said. "You don't have to. 2 people work faster than 1. May looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Get a shovel." They worked the debris out together in under an hour, breaking the ice blockage, clearing the channel, stabilizing the bank enough to prevent another shift. May worked without stopping, without complaint, without the particular kind of self-consciousness that some people brought to being watched while they labored. She simply worked, and she was good at it, and Jack found himself having to deliberately redirect his attention back to his own shovel more than once. When they finished, they stood at the bank and watched the water find its proper course again. "Thank you," Jack said. "We both needed it fixed," May said. "Don't thank me for that. I'm thanking you for letting me help." She looked at him sideways. "You're a strange man, Jack Callaway." "I've been told." Not as an insult, just as an observation. She shouldered her shovel. "Do you want coffee?" He followed her inside without hesitation, and neither of them remarked on that. Her kitchen was practical and without decoration, except for 2 things: a hand-drawn map of the property pinned to the wall beside the window, covered in notations in her father's handwriting, and then her own, and a shelf of books above the small table that included 3 volumes Jack recognized, and several he didn't. He was looking at the books when she set the coffee down. "You read Blackstone," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd spotted the spine commentaries on the laws of England worn at the corners clearly used. "My father's," May said. "He believed a property owner who didn't understand property law was at a permanent disadvantage. He made me read it when I was 17. She sat down across from him. "He was right. You understood it at 17. Not all of it, but enough." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "It's why I knew the 1876 survey mattered. Most people wouldn't have thought to look for a second document. My father taught me to look for the second document." Jack thought about the way she had produced that map at her doorstep, unhurried, prepared, already holding the answer he hadn't known she had. He thought about the 11 feet of fence line, the 9 years of improperly placed posts, and how long she had known and said nothing until the moment when it was genuinely necessary. "Why didn't you bring the survey forward sooner?" he asked. "You could have pressed the claim years ago." May was quiet for a moment. Because pressing a claim and being right aren't the same thing, she said. If I'd come at your family with a map when I was 25 and newly alone on this property, it would have looked like aggression. It would have started a fight I didn't have the resources to finish. My father's mistake was letting the dispute become personal. I decided early on not to repeat it. So you waited. I was ready, she corrected quietly. There's a difference. Jack drank his coffee and didn't say anything for a moment, because there was nothing useful to add to that. She was right, and the simplicity of it that patience wasn't passivity, but preparation settled into him in a way that he suspected would stay. Your father sounds like he was a careful man, he said finally. He was, and a proud one, which cost him. She looked at the map on the wall. He and your father could have resolved the boundary question in an afternoon if either of them had been willing to go first. Instead, they spent 15 years being right at each other across a fence line. Her voice was even not bitter. I swore I wasn't going to do that. And yet here you are, Jack said, having coffee with a Callaway. May's mouth curved, the almost smile the one she kept most of the way in reserve. Here I am, she agreed. February brought a thaw and then another freeze, and then Mabel Horton from the neighboring spread to the north announced that she was selling half her herd because her youngest son had decided to become a schoolteacher in Denver, which was apparently the kind of thing that happened in families where you didn't watch carefully enough. The Ridgeback Mercantile was the information hub of the county, and it was there on a Thursday morning in the second week of February that Jack overheard two men discussing the Horton cattle, specifically discussing that May Whitfield had put in an offer for 10 head. He wasn't eavesdropping. They were simply talking at a volume that didn't account for the acoustics of a small general store. She doesn't have the pasture for it, one of them said. It was Len Pratt who ran cattle on the west side of the valley and had opinions about everything. Not with the drought pressure last summer. She'd be overextending. She seems to know what she's doing, the other said more neutrally. She seems like it, Len agreed. But seeming isn't the same as doing. She's been running that place alone too long. She needs someone to tell her when she's making a mistake. Jack set down the hardware he'd come in to purchase and turned around. She's been running that place alone just fine for 3 years, he said pleasantly. And I'd be careful about deciding what she needs, Len. She's generally about 5 steps ahead of the people who are sure they know better. Len Pratt looked at him. You're defending May Whitfield now. I'm correcting an inaccurate statement. That's different. There was a beat of silence in the store. Len's expression shifted through something that Jack didn't bother trying to interpret, and then the man picked up his own purchases and left without another word. Jack bought his hardware. He rode home thinking about the conversation, specifically about the moment he'd turned around and spoken, which had not been a calculated decision. He had simply reacted, immediately and without particular deliberation. He was not sure what to do with that. He told May about it the next time he saw her because he thought she deserved to know. He wasn't going to make it into something it wasn't, but he also wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, That was unnecessary, but kind. It was accurate, he said. The kindness was incidental. Was it? Jack met her eyes. No, he admitted. It wasn't entirely incidental. May nodded slowly. She didn't press it, didn't turn it into something he'd have to respond to. She just received it, held it carefully the way she seemed to hold most things without making a performance of it. The cattle purchase is sound, she said after a moment. I've run the numbers 4 different ways. The south pasture can carry the additional head with the boundary correction factored in. The 11 feet matters more than it sounds. I know it does. I wanted you to know I didn't make the decision carelessly. Jack frowned. I never thought you did. Len Pratt did. Len Pratt thinks a great many things that aren't worth the air they take up, Jack said, and this time May did smile fully completely without pulling it back. It was the first time he'd seen the whole version of it. It lasted only a second or two, but it hit him with the particular force of something he'd been half waiting for, without knowing it, the way you don't notice you've been holding your breath until you finally exhale. He looked away first. The squash dispute arrived in March. It began as May's confrontations with the world generally began with a fact. A simple, incontrovertible, entirely inconvenient fact. Specifically, the heirloom squash she had been cultivating for 2 seasons, a variety her mother had grown, and her grandmother before that, had spread across the old boundary line in the southwest corner of the property, taking root on what was now, per the corrected survey, unambiguously Jack's land. May walked the corner in early March and stood looking at the volunteer squash plants with an expression that Orville later described with characteristic precision as a woman doing arithmetic in her head and not liking the answer. She went to Jack's door that afternoon. "I have a problem," she said. He looked at her. "Come in. I'll say this at the door. It's embarrassing enough without taking up your kitchen." She straightened her shoulders. "My squash has crossed the property line into your southwest corner. The plants are established they came up from seed that traveled with the runoff last fall. I didn't plant them there intentionally, but they're there, and they're on your land, and I need to know if you're going to make an issue of it." Jack stared at her. "Are you asking me if I'm going to evict your squash?" "I'm asking if you have an objection to me harvesting from your land this fall." May. "Jack, it's squash. It's my mother's squash," she said, and her voice held something different there. Not vulnerability exactly, but the edge of it, the place where practical and personal stopped being separate things. "It's the only variety I have left. My mother brought the seeds from Ohio when she came west in 1862. If I lose this season's seed stock, I lose the line entirely." Jack was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "You can harvest whatever comes up on my land," he said. "I wouldn't touch it regardless. Harvest all of it." May exhaled. It was small, controlled, but it was there. "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me for that." She almost smiled again. "You sound like me." "Maybe you're a good influence." There it was, a flash of genuine warmth in her eyes, real and unguarded, here and gone. "Don't push your luck, Calloway," he grinned. "Wouldn't dream of it." The squash negotiation, which was what Jack privately called it, though it had lasted approximately 90 seconds, opened something between them that the chicken and the creek and the fence survey had been building toward without quite arriving. They began without formally deciding to simply showing up in each other's vicinity more often, not calling on each other for problems, not inventing excuses, just appearing. Jack at her fence line with a question about the spring planting schedule. May at his gate with an observation about the weather pattern coming in from the northwest. Small practical things that didn't need to be said and were said anyway. Orville noticed. He said nothing, which was his way of saying quite a lot. The town noticed too, which was Ridgeback's way of eventually noticing everything. It was Clara Marsh at the dry goods who first said something directly to May with the friendly impertinence of a woman who had known May since childhood and considered directness a form of affection. "You and Jack Calloway are getting friendly," Clara said, not as a question. "We're neighbors," May said. "We share a fence line and a water source. It makes sense to communicate." "You've been communicating quite a bit for people who used to barely exchange 2 words at the town meetings. We resolved the boundary survey. It changed the relationship." "Did it?" Clara handed her the dry goods package across the counter. "He told Len Pratt off in the middle of the mercantile last month on your behalf, May. That's not fence line communication." May took the package. She did not answer immediately, which Clara understood to be an answer. "He's a good man," May said finally. "He's been unexpectedly decent about everything. About the survey, the water rights, all of it. I misjudged his character when we were younger. Most people around here had him figured for stubborn and standoffish. He is both of those things," May said. "He's also honest, and he's fair, and—" She stopped. "And," Clara prompted. "And he makes me laugh," May said quietly, "which I didn't expect at all." Clara said nothing. She was wise enough to know when a silence was doing more work than words could. April arrived, and with it the Ridgeback Spring Exchange, a semi-formal gathering at the Grange Hall, where ranchers and farmers traded seed stock, compared notes on winter losses, and conducted the social business that kept a small community functional through the long stretches between it. Jack and May arrived separately. This was not a decision, it was simply how it happened. Both of them coming from their own properties, their own mornings, their own lives. But they ended up at the same table during the seed exchange portion of the afternoon, both looking at the same heirloom corn varieties, and the conversation that started there ran through the rest of the afternoon without either of them noticing how much time had passed. They talked about corn, and then about planting schedules, and then about the drought risk, and then about a legal dispute 2 counties over that had set a precedent for water rights along shared creek beds. May had read about the case in the Helena paper. Jack had not, but he followed her explanation with the focused attention of someone who understood immediately why it mattered. If that precedent holds, he said, it changes the water rights calculation on our creek. It does, May said. I've been thinking about it for a month. We should probably have both claims formally documented before someone else decides to make an issue of it. Agreed. I'll file a joint use declaration if you will. I'll draft the language, May said. You review it. If we both sign and file, no one can contest it later. Jack looked at her across the table. You've already drafted it, haven't you? May met his eyes without blinking. I drafted a preliminary version, she said. In February. Jack laughed. It came out loud enough that 2 people at the next table turned to look. He didn't care. May Whitfield, he said, you are the most prepared person I have ever met in my life. It's a reasonable response to an uncertain world, she said primly, but her eyes were bright. It is. It absolutely is. He was still smiling. Is there anything about our shared property situation that you haven't already thought through, documented, and drafted a legal response to? She considered this with apparent seriousness. The squash, she said. I did not anticipate the squash. Nobody anticipates the squash. No, she agreed. The squash was a surprise. They were both smiling now across a table covered in seed catalogs at the Ridgeback Spring Exchange, and several people in the Grange Hall were watching them without appearing to watch them, and neither Jack nor May was paying the slightest attention. The Joint Water Rights Declaration was filed with the county clerk in the 3rd week of April. Horace Blunt accepted it with the same imperturbable efficiency he brought to everything. Filed the notations, stamped the copies, and handed them both their documents. As they walked out of the clerk's office again side by side, into the spring air that had finally lost its bite, Jack said, That's the 2nd time we've come in here together. 3rd, May said. If you count when we were both here for the road survey meeting in January of last year and didn't speak to each other. Jack looked at her. You remember that? You were standing by the window. You looked. She paused, choosing her word. Preoccupied. I was having a difficult month. I know. I heard about the trouble with the North herd. She glanced at him sideways. I considered offering to help. I decided it wasn't my place. Jack stopped walking. She went 2 steps further before she stopped and turned back. You could have offered, he said. I would have. He paused. I might have been stupid enough to say no, but I would have been grateful. May looked at him steadily. We weren't this then, she said, gesturing vaguely at the space between them. No, Jack agreed. We weren't. A beat of silence. The spring wind moved between them. What are we now? She asked. She said it simply without coyness or strategic retreat. Just the question plain and honest hanging in the air. Jack looked at her for a long moment. I'm not entirely sure, he said. But I know I look for your light in the morning when I go out to the east field. May's breath shifted. Barely visible, just a small adjustment. A slight change in the set of her shoulders. I know I set a 2nd cup out some mornings before I've thought about whether there's a reason to, she said quietly. And then I don't put it away. Jack said nothing. Neither did she. The space between them had weight now, not uncomfortable, not pressured, but real. The kind of weight you feel when something has shifted, and both people know it, and neither one is ready to name it yet. I should get back, May said finally. Orville's waiting on me for the afternoon fence check. I'll walk you to your horse. You don't have to. I know, he said. He walked her to her horse. She mounted with her usual efficiency, looked down at him from the saddle, and held his gaze for one moment longer than she needed to. Jack, she said. May. Something moved across her face, decision and restraint in quick succession, and then she simply said, "Good afternoon," and turned her horse and rode. Jack stood in the street and watched her until she was around the corner, and then stood a moment longer for reasons he didn't examine, and then walked to find his own horse carrying the second cup's worth of something he didn't yet have a word for. Orville. When May returned to the property that afternoon, looked at her face, and quietly went back to mending fence without a word. He had worked for this family long enough to recognize when a person needed to think, and he understood that thinking was best done in silence. May checked the south pasture. She walked the east fence line. She stood for a moment at the shared boundary, looking at the corrected post placement, the 11 feet of proper ground that had taken 9 years to find. She thought about second cups left on the counter. She thought about a man who turned around in the middle of a general store because someone said something unfair. She thought about the squash, her mother's squash, growing wild and unharvested across a boundary line that had finally been put right. And the man who had said harvest all of it without a moment's hesitation, like it was the only possible answer. She went inside. She made coffee. She set out one cup and then, after a moment's pause, set out a second one. She left it there until it was cold, then put it away, and said nothing to anyone about any of it. The second cup became a habit. May didn't speak aloud. She didn't examine it too closely the way you don't examine a thing you're afraid to name before it's ready. She simply set it out some mornings and let it sit. And on the mornings she didn't set it out, she noticed the absence more than the presence, which told her something she filed away without yet acting on. May Whitfield was a woman who understood timing. She had learned it from the land that planting too early killed the seed just as surely as planting too late, and that the difference between the two was not a calendar, but a knowing, a felt sense of when the ground was ready. She applied this principle to most things in her life. She was applying it now somewhat desperately to Jack Calloway. The problem was that Jack seemed to be applying his own version of the same principle, which meant they were both waiting for the other to go first, which was either a standoff or a courtship, depending on how you looked at it, and May was no longer entirely sure which one she was living inside. May was no longer entirely sure which one she was living inside. Spring moved into summer the way Montana springs always did. Fast, and then faster. The cold breaking almost overnight, and the grass coming up so green it looked painted. And suddenly, there was too much work to do, and not enough hours, and the pleasant agony of a productive season demanding everything you had. Jack's cattle were healthy. May's new herd additions, the 10 head from Mabel Horton, which Len Pratt had said she couldn't carry, were thriving on the south pasture exactly as she had calculated. She checked them every morning with the focused satisfaction of someone whose arithmetic had been proven correct by the living world. Orville watched her check the cattle one morning in late May and said without preamble, "He came by yesterday afternoon." May kept her eyes on the herd. "Who?" Orville gave her the look he reserved for questions he considered beneath both of them. "Calloway. Said he wanted to check on the drainage situation on the shared bank. I told him you were in town. He stayed 20 minutes looking at the water and then left." "Was there a drainage issue?" "Not one he couldn't have seen in 30 seconds, Orville said. He stayed 20 minutes. May said nothing. She counted her cattle with unnecessary precision and walked back to the house, and Orville went back to his work, and neither of them said another word about it. The summer brought two things that changed the texture of their arrangement: a drought warning in July that sent every rancher in the county into a state of controlled emergency, and a legal notice that arrived at May's door on a Wednesday morning and turned her blood cold. The drought. She handled the way she handled most crises methodically, one decision at a time. She rotated her pastures more aggressively, reduced her herd's daily range, checked the creek levels 3 times a week. The creek, Callaway Creek, Miller Creek. Their creek was holding fed by a spring higher up the mountain that didn't depend on summer rainfall. This was the reason the water rights filing mattered, and both of them knew it, and neither said it directly, which was another form of the second cup conversation they were constantly having. Jack rode the creek bank with her twice that summer, and both times the conversation was practical and focused and exactly what it needed to be. And both times when they parted at the fence line, there was a moment brief and charged where neither of them moved immediately. He always spoke first eventually. Something sensible about the weather or the pasture rotation. She always answered in kind. And then they went their separate ways, and May went home and stood in her kitchen and felt the particular frustration of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and was choosing deliberately to wait until the moment was right. The legal notice was a different kind of problem entirely. She read it twice at her kitchen table, then read it a third time because she wanted to be absolutely certain she understood what it said before she allowed herself to react to it. It was from a land company out of Billings Holt and Associates Land Corporation, and it contained a claim that a portion of the Whitfield property was subject to an outstanding lien from a loan her father had taken in 1874 that had never been formally discharged. May set the paper down on the table. She sat very still for a moment. Then she went and got Blackstone off the shelf. She spent 4 hours with the legal notice, her father's papers, and every document she had inherited with the property. She found the original loan record. She found the repayment ledger her father had kept meticulous dated witnessed. She found a receipt of payment from 1877 signed by the lending party's agent acknowledging discharge of the debt. The claim was invalid. The debt had been paid. She had the proof in her hands. But the claim had been filed with the county, which meant it was on record, which meant it had to be formally contested, which meant a legal proceeding, which meant time and money, and the specific exhausting weight of having to prove something that should never have needed proving. She also noticed something else. The portion of the Whitfield property that Holt and Associates was claiming, the lien covered 40 acres on the southeast corner, was adjacent to Jack's land. More specifically, it covered the area where the corrected fence line ran, where the squash grew, where the drainage issue had been. The geometry of it was not accidental. May recognized a land grab when she saw one. She just hadn't expected one this sophisticated or this patient. Someone had done their research. Someone had found the old loan record, identified the gap in the discharge documentation, a gap that existed because the receipt was in her father's private papers rather than the county record, and filed a claim calculated to be difficult to disprove without significant effort. She sat with this for a long time. Then she put on her coat and went to Jack's door. She didn't tell him about the notice immediately. She asked him first whether he had received any communication from a land company called Holt and Associates. Jack's expression shifted in a way that told her everything before he spoke. "They sent a representative out in June," he said. "Man named Greer. He wanted to discuss purchasing the east 40 acres, said the company was consolidating land in this valley for a rail corridor project." May felt something go very quiet inside her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the land wasn't for sale. He left a card." Jack looked at her carefully. "Why?" She handed him the legal notice. He read it. The silence while he read it was the kind May had learned to measure. She could tell the quality of Jack Calloway's attention by the quality of his silence, and this one was focused and increasingly hard. He set the paper down. He looked at her. "This is manufactured," he said. "Yes, they're claiming a lien on the southeast corner, which is adjacent to your east 40. Jack was quiet for a moment, making the same calculation she had made. If the lien stands, they have grounds to push a forced sale on the Whitfield southeast parcel. And once they own that parcel, they have leverage on the entire shared boundary." He paused. "Including the creek. And once they control the creek access point," May said, Every property in this valley that uses that water is negotiating from weakness, Jack finished. They looked at each other across his kitchen table. I have the discharge receipt, May said. My father paid the debt in full in 1877. I have the ledger and the signed receipt from the lending agent. The claim is baseless. Then we file a formal contest. I'll need to appear before the county judge. It could take months. Who's your attorney? May paused. I haven't retained one. I've been handling my own legal filings. Jack leaned forward. May, this isn't a water rights declaration. This is a corporate land claim with a law firm behind it. You need representation. I'm aware of that, she said quietly. I'm also aware that legal representation costs money I'd planned to use for the winter herd supplies. The silence that followed was different from their usual silences. This one had an edge. I'll cover the attorney fees, Jack said. May straightened immediately. No. It affects my land too. It affects my land, she said, and her voice was flat and final in a way he'd never heard before. My property, my father's debt, my legal matter. I appreciate the offer, and the answer is no. Jack looked at her. The set of her jaw was absolute. He recognized in that moment that pushing would be the single worst thing he could do. Not because she was being irrational, but because she was being exactly who she was, and arguing with, that would be arguing against the thing he respected most about her. All right, he said, but I'll accept your help preparing the case, she said. If you're willing. You know the land history as well as anyone, better than most. Yes, Jack said without hesitation. Whatever you need. May nodded. Then let's start tonight. They worked through the evening and into the night. Jack's kitchen table covered in documents, May's ledgers and receipts spread in chronological order, both of them cross-referencing dates and amounts against the Holt and Associates claim, line by line. Jack made coffee without asking. May accepted it without thanks, which by now was its own kind of language between them. At some point past 10 o'clock, Orville appeared at Jack's door with May's coat which she'd left at her house, and a look on his face that combined resignation with something suspiciously close to approval. He handed over the coat, said, "Don't stay too late," in the direction of no one in particular, and left. Jack and May both pretended not to notice the subtext. By midnight, they had built a case that was, May said with quiet certainty, airtight. The discharge receipt was dated, witnessed, and signed by an authorized agent of the original lending party. The ledger payments aligned exactly with the loan schedule. There was no gap, only an unfiled receipt, and the law did not require a creditor's acknowledgement to be filed with the county to constitute valid discharge. They knew this, May said, looking at the assembled documents. They knew the receipt existed. They filed anyway, counting on the fact that most people wouldn't have it. Or wouldn't know what to do with it, Jack said. Or would be too tired or too afraid to fight it. She looked up. That's the calculation. Find the properties where the owner is isolated or under-resourced and file a claim that costs more to fight than to settle. How many properties do you think they've done this to? May had been wondering the same thing for the past 3 hours. I don't know. But I think we should find out before the hearing. If there are other affected properties, the judge needs to know he's not looking at an isolated dispute. He's looking at a pattern. Jack looked at her across the table. The lamp was low, and the night was quiet, and she had a smudge of ink on the side of her hand from cross-referencing the ledger entries. She was looking at the documents with the focused intensity of someone who had stopped being afraid and started being angry. And the anger was the clean, useful kind. Not hot and destructive, but cold and precise, the kind that built arguments instead of burning things down. You're going to win this, he said. May looked at him. We're going to win it, she said. He did not correct her. The harvest social at Ridgeback Grange Hall had been a tradition since before either of them was born, held every year in the first week of September when the summer work was done and the fall work hadn't fully begun, and the whole valley needed an evening to remember what it was doing this for. May almost didn't go. She had the legal contest hearing scheduled for late October, and the preparation was ongoing, and she was in contact with 2 other property owners in the valley who had received similar notices from Holt and Associates, a widow named Frances Albright, whose late husband had left the same kind of incomplete discharge documentation, and a young homesteader named Thomas Reed, who had simply assumed the claim must be valid and had been on the verge of settling before May reached him. Her attendance at the Harvest Social was, she told Orville, a decision based on community obligation and nothing else. Orville said, "Of course," in the tone of a man who had decided life was too short to argue about obvious things. She wore her good dress. She had not worn it since the previous Harvest Social. She did not remark on this. Jack was there when she arrived, standing near the far wall with 2 ranchers from the North Valley, and he saw her the moment she walked in the door. She knew he saw her because he stopped talking mid-sentence. The man he was speaking to turned to look at whatever had caused the interruption, saw nothing of obvious significance, and continued the conversation. Jack rejoined it a beat later. May went to speak with Clara Marsh and Frances Albright, and did not look in his direction for the first hour, which required more discipline than the legal brief. It was during the supper portion of the evening that he found her. She was standing near the side door with a plate she hadn't touched, talking to Thomas Reed about the Holt and Associates timeline when Jack appeared beside her with the naturalness of someone who had simply ended up there. "Reed," Jack said, nodding to the young man. "Calloway," Thomas said, visibly relieved to have an exit from a conversation that had become unexpectedly complicated. "I'll think about what you said, Miss Whitfield." He departed. May and Jack stood together for a moment in the specific social privacy that a crowded room can offer when no one is directly attending to you. "How's the case?" Jack asked. "Strong," she said. "I found 2 other affected properties, Frances Albright and Thomas Reed. Both received similar notices in the spring. Does the judge know?" "He will. I'm filing the supplementary documentation next week. That changes the nature of the hearing entirely. That's the idea." She set her untouched plate down on a nearby table. 3 affected properties makes it a scheme. 1 affected property makes it a dispute. The difference matters enormously. Jack was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she'd been seeing more frequently, something that wasn't quite admiration, and wasn't quite something else, and was possibly both at once. "At this rate," he said, and his voice had the particular warmth of someone who was using humor to stand just at the edge of something serious, "you are going to have run legal circles around every land company in the territory before you're 40. "I intend to," May said. "And have you given any thought?" He paused, and something shifted in his voice, moved from teasing to something quieter. "To what else you intend after the hearing, after all of this is settled?" May looked at him directly. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" Jack stopped, looked at his coffee cup, looked back at her. He was not a man who stumbled over his words. She had never seen him do it before, and the fact that he was doing it now told her something significant. "You are the most self-sufficient person I know, May. You have your property, your legal mind, your plans, your mother's squash. You don't need anyone." "That's true," she said carefully. "And yet," he said. The words sat there between them, carrying more weight than any of the legal documents on her kitchen table. "And yet," she agreed just as quietly. Jack looked at her. The Harvest Social continued around them, fiddle music conversations, the clatter of dishes, and they were standing in the middle of all of it, in a bubble of complete stillness. "I look for your light every morning," he said. "You know that. I told you that in April." "I remember. I want to tell you something else." He turned to face her fully. "I have not had a single day since January where I didn't find some reason, some genuinely reasonable, entirely legitimate reason to think about you. About how you'd approach a problem I was having. About what you'd say about something I read. About whether you were warm enough on the cold nights, which is—" He stopped, half laughed at himself. "Which is not a practical concern, and I know that." May's chest was doing something she had very limited control over. "Jack." "I'm almost finished," he said. "I want to tell you that somewhere between a chicken and a boundary survey and your mother's squash, I stopped being your neighbor and started being something I don't have a polite frontier word for. And I think you know that. And I think—" he paused. "I think you might be in a similar situation, but I have learned better than to assume I know what May Whitfield is thinking." The silence lasted exactly long enough. "You are not wrong," May said. Jack let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for some time. "However," she said, and his expression shifted with instant wariness. Because he had learned that however from May, Whitfield required full attention, "I am not going to do anything about it until after the October hearing. I can't afford to be distracted right now. Francis Albright and Thomas Reed are depending on this case. 3 properties, Jack. I can't lose focus." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is either the most rational thing I've ever heard," he said, "or the most May Whitfield thing I've ever heard." "They are the same thing," she said. "They are," he agreed. He almost smiled. "October." "October," she said. He raised his coffee cup very slightly, the way a man might raise a glass in a toast, and she held his gaze, and the fiddle music played, and the harvest social went on around them, and neither of them looked away for a long time. It was only afterward, when the social was breaking up, and people were collecting their coats and saying their goodnights, that the moment arrived. Jack had found her at the door. He was saying something low and sensible about the October filing deadline, when Hank Briggs, a rancher May had known since childhood, loud and well-meaning in equal measure, clapped Jack on the shoulder and grinned at them both. "You two are always in a corner together," Hank said cheerfully, oblivious to timing or atmosphere. "At this rate, you'll never get married, May Whitfield. Too busy arguing with your neighbor." The room had not gone entirely quiet, but the people nearby had. May did not blush. She did not look away. She had known in some cellular way that something like this moment was coming, some pressure that would require a declaration or a retreat, and she had known for months which one she would choose. She set down her cup. She turned to face Jack with those steady brown eyes, and she said it the way she said everything that mattered, simply, clearly, without flinching. "Only when you propose to me, Jack." The nearby conversation stopped. Hank Briggs blinked. Several heads turned. Jack Calloway looked at her. The color moved up from his collar. And for the first time in all their months of arguments and negotiations and second cups of coffee and fence surveys, he had absolutely nothing to say. May picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "Good night," she said pleasantly to the room in general, and walked out into the September night. Jack stood in the doorway of the Ridgeback Grange Hall with the harvest social going very quietly behind him, and the cold air coming in, and the sound of her footsteps on the wooden steps. And he thought with the absolute clarity of a man who has just had something important made plain, that he had spent 9 months being patient and careful and respectful of timing, and he was done with all of it. He went after her. She had not gone far. She was standing at the edge of the steps, coat in her hands, looking up at the sky with an expression that told him she had known he would follow and had been ready for it. "May." She turned. "I need you to be very clear with me," he said. His voice was quiet and direct and entirely without his usual humor. Was that an answer to a question that hasn't been asked yet? Or a challenge? Or a door you just opened? May looked at him for a long moment. The stars were sharp above them, and the light from the hall was warm behind him, and she could hear the fiddle starting up again inside. "Jack Calloway," she said quietly, "you have been standing at that door for 9 months. I've been waiting on the other side of it." He took one step toward her. "The hearing is in October," she said, and her voice was steady, even if the rest of her wasn't. "I know," he said. "I can wait 6 more weeks." "Good," she said, but she didn't move away. He didn't move closer. They stood there in the September cold, very close, and entirely still, and the door between them was open now, undeniably open, and both of them knew it, and the 6 weeks between this moment and October felt like both forever and nothing at all. "Good night, Jack," she said finally. "Good night, May," he said. She walked to her horse. He watched her go. He stayed on the steps until she was out of sight, and then stayed a moment longer, looking at the dark road she'd taken, and felt something large and certain settle into his chest. 6 weeks. He could do 6 weeks. 6 weeks felt like 6 months. Jack had said he could wait, and he meant it, and he kept his word. But keeping his word turned out to require considerably more effort than he had anticipated standing on those steps in the September dark. The problem was not patience in the abstract. Jack Calloway was a patient man by nature and by trade. Ranching did not reward impatience, and he had spent 32 years learning to work on the land's schedule rather than his own. The problem was specifically and entirely May Whitfield, who continued to exist on the property adjacent to his, who continued to appear at his fence line with practical questions and sensible observations, who continued to look at him with those brown eyes that said everything and gave away nothing, and who had apparently decided that 6 weeks of waiting meant 6 weeks of business as usual. He respected it. He also found it quietly maddening. They worked on the hearing preparation together 3 evenings a week through September and into October. May's kitchen table became their operations center documents in organized rows, her father's ledger open to the discharge entries, the Holt and Associates filing cross-referenced against county records going back 15 years. May had written to the state land office in Helena, requesting records of all Holt and Associates filings in Montana, and the response had arrived in the second week of September, thick enough that she'd had to clear an entire section of the table to spread it out. 11 properties. Holt and Associates had filed similar lien claims against 11 properties across 3 counties in the past 2 years. May read through the list twice, her face carefully neutral, and then she looked at Jack across the table and said, "We need to contact all of them." "That's 3 counties worth of people," Jack said. "I know. The hearing is in 4 weeks. "I know that too." She was already reaching for paper. "Some of them may have settled. Some may have already lost their property. But if any of them still have their discharge documentation—" She stopped writing and looked up. "Jack, if we can bring even 4 or 5 of these cases to the judge alongside ours, this stops being a property dispute. It becomes a fraud case. That's a different courtroom entirely." Jack looked at her. "That's also a different level of risk. If Holt and Associates has a law firm behind them, they have Greer," May said flatly. "I looked him up. Edmund Greer, land acquisition agent. He's not an attorney. He finds properties files the claims pressures owners into settling and takes a percentage. The actual legal filings are done by a firm in Billings called Marsh & Cole." She paused. "They handle 12 active land acquisition cases in Montana. They are very good at what they do." "And you intend to walk into that hearing and face them yourself?" "I intend to walk into that hearing with 11 documented cases of fraudulent lien filings, a signed discharge receipt, a corroborating ledger, and a county clerk's record that supports every word of it." She set down her pen. "And I intend to ask the judge to refer the entire Holt and Associates operation to the state attorney general." The silence that followed was the specific kind that occurs when someone says something that is simultaneously unexpected and completely inevitable. "May," Jack said, "don't tell me it's too aggressive." "I wasn't going to. I was going to say—" He stopped, and what crossed his face was something she hadn't quite seen there before. Not admiration exactly. Something closer to awe. "I was going to say that your father would have been proud of you." May looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw shifted. When she spoke, her voice was level, but not entirely steady. "Don't say that when I have 4 weeks of work left to do," she said quietly. "I can't afford to feel things right now." "Right," Jack said. "After October." "After October." He poured more coffee. She picked up her pen. They went back to work. The letters went out to all 11 properties. 7 responded. Of those 7, 3 had already settled with Holt and Associates, signed over partial land rights under pressure, believing the lien was valid, not knowing they had other options. Those 3 responses arrived in May's mailbox with the particular weight of things that had gone wrong before anyone thought to look, and she read each one at her kitchen table alone, and felt the specific anger of someone who understands exactly what happened and cannot undo it. She wrote back to all 3 anyway. She explained what she had found. She told them that a state referral, if granted, might provide grounds for recovery of the settled rights. She made no promises. She gave them the truth as clearly as she could give it, which was the only thing she had to offer. 4 of the 7 were still fighting. 2 of them, a homesteader couple named the Garfields from Carbon County, and a widow named Helena Voss from Yellowstone County, had documentation as clean and clear as May's. They agreed to submit affidavits for the hearing. The other 2 had weaker cases, partial records, unsigned receipts, but agreed to submit whatever they had for the pattern. Jack rode with May to the Garfield property on a Saturday in the first week of October to collect the affidavit in person. It was the first time they'd traveled together any significant distance, and the 5-hour round trip had a particular quality, easy and unhurried, the kind of conversation that unspools naturally when 2 people have stopped performing for each other and are simply present. They talked about everything and nothing. The Garfields' land, the weather coming in from the northwest, a book May had read and Jack hadn't, the way the county had changed since their father's time. Small things, all of it, but the small things had weight now. On the ride back, as the afternoon light started dropping, Jack said without particular preamble, "Tell me about your mother." May glanced at him. "Why?" "The squash," he said simply. "You said she brought the seeds from Ohio. I want to know who she was." May was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of reluctance, the silence of someone deciding how much of a true thing to give. "She was precise," May said finally. "About everything. The way she kept the house, the way she managed the kitchen garden, the way she read always with a pencil, always marking the important parts. She would have liked the Blackstone." A pause. "She was funny. People didn't always expect that from her because she was quiet. But she had a dry humor that would come out at unexpected moments and catch you completely off guard." Jack said nothing, listening. "She died before any of this. The boundary dispute, the water rights, all of it became my problem. I think about that sometimes. Whether she would have handled it differently." May looked at the road ahead. "I think she would have handled it the same way. She believed in documentation. She believed in knowing your rights before you needed them." A small private smile. "She's why I read Blackstone at 17. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Jack said. "She was," May said simply. "She was exactly that." They rode in silence for a while, the comfortable kind. "My father was the opposite," Jack said eventually. "Instinct over documentation. He kept almost nothing in writing. It cost him the boundary dispute, other things. He knew things but couldn't prove them. And in law, knowing and proving are different countries." He paused. "I've tried to be different, more careful. But I think I learned the caution late, and May." He glanced at her. "I think you were born with it." "Born with it," May said, "and then trained to within an inch of my life." She looked at him sideways. "We came out from opposite directions and ended up in the same place." "Sharing a fence line," Jack said. "Among other things," May said. He held her gaze for one beat. Then the road curved and both of them looked forward again, and neither spoke for the rest of the ride, and the silence had the particular quality of something that had been fully said without words. The hearing was scheduled for October 22nd before County Judge Arthur Hale, a man of 60 who had been on the bench for 20 years and who had, according to Horace Blunt at the clerk's office, no patience for wasted time and an excellent memory for precedent. May had prepared for this hearing the way she prepared for everything completely specifically, and several weeks before she needed to. She had a written argument. She had her evidence arranged in chronological order. She had the Garfield affidavit, the Voss affidavit, and the records from the other 2 partial documentation properties as supporting exhibits. She had the State Land Office records showing all 11 Holt and Associates filings. And she had arrived by post 3 days before the hearing, a document she had not expected. It was a letter from the State Attorney General's office in Helena. They had received a query from whom it did not specify, though May had her suspicions regarding the Holt and Associates land acquisition operation. They were, the letter said, conducting a preliminary review. They requested copies of any relevant documentation she had compiled. May read the letter at her kitchen table 3 times. Then she looked at Jack, who was sitting across from her, and said, "Did you write to the Attorney General's office?" Jack met her eyes with the careful expression of a man who has been caught doing something he believed was right and is prepared to defend it, but would rather not have to. "I wrote to a man I know in Helena, who knows the Attorney General. I didn't file anything official. I simply described the situation and the pattern, and asked whether it was the kind of thing the state might want to be aware of." May put the letter down. "I told you this was my legal matter." "You told me not to cover your attorney fees," Jack said. "You said nothing about writing a letter to a personal contact describing a potential pattern of statewide land fraud." He paused. "Those are different things." May stared at him. "That is an extremely precise distinction." "I learned precision from my neighbor," he said. She wanted to be angry. She had been for approximately 30 seconds the time it took to read the letter and look up at him. But the anger had run into something else, the knowledge that he had done it carefully, that he had not acted in her name or filed anything that affected her case, that he had simply used what he had access to on behalf of something he believed in. "It may affect the hearing," she said finally. "If the judge knows the Attorney General is watching, he'll know Holt and Associates is already under scrutiny," Jack said. "Which means your filing isn't a lone complaint. It's the most documented piece of a larger picture." May was quiet. "That's good strategy," she said. "I thought so." Another silence. "Thank you," she said. The words came out simply without the usual careful distance. "Jack, thank you." "You're welcome," he said. Just that. No deflection, no humor, no careful retreat. He held her gaze and let it land. October 22nd arrived cold and clear. May dressed in her good wool dress and her winter coat and checked her document case 4 times before she left the house. Orville stood on the porch and watched her check the case and said nothing, which meant he was proud of her and didn't have words for it, which was his highest form of expression. Jack met her at the county courthouse steps at 9 in the morning. He was in his good coat hat in hand, and the sight of him there, having ridden in from his property, having arranged his own morning around her hearing, hit May somewhere she had learned to not examine too closely until October was finished. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They went in together. Edmund Greer of Holt and Associates was already seated at the respondent's table, with a lawyer from Marsh and Cole, a compact man named Aldridge, who had the polished, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to winning in smaller courtrooms than this. He looked at May across the room with the professional neutrality of a man who had already calculated the outcome and found it favorable. May looked back at him with the professional neutrality of a woman who had 11 exhibits, 2 affidavits, and a letter from the state attorney general's office in her document case. Judge Hale entered at 9 sharp, took his seat, and looked at both tables with the economical attention of someone who had been doing this long enough to know the difference between a genuine dispute and a waste of his time. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "you're contesting a lien claim filed by Holt and Associates Land Corporation against the southeast corner of your property. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you're representing yourself?" "I am." Aldridge's expression did not change, but something shifted in it, a slight recalibration, a microscopic adjustment in the direction of underestimation. May saw it. She had expected it. She had factored it into her presentation because the moment a man underestimated her was the moment her evidence hit hardest. She laid out her case with the methodical precision of someone who had rehearsed it until it was automatic and could now deliver it with her full attention available for the judge's reactions rather than her own memory. The original loan, the payment schedule, the discharge receipt authenticated, dated, witnessed, the ledger entries, the county records. Each document presented in order, each cross-reference noted, each date aligned. When she finished, Aldridge rose and presented Holt and Associates' position that the discharge had never been officially recorded with the county, that without a county filing, the debt remained legally outstanding, that the Whitfield property was subject to the lien as filed. The law does not require a county filing to constitute valid discharge. May said clearly the moment the judge indicated she could respond. Section 14 of the Montana Territory Property Code specifies that a signed receipt from an authorized agent of the creditor constitutes discharge upon delivery. My father received that receipt in 1877. I have it here. The agent's authority to sign is documented by his employment record, which I have also provided as Exhibit C. Aldridge shifted his argument. The authenticity of the receipt is supported by the agent's signature, which matches his signature on 3 other documents filed with this court during the same period. May said, I have provided Exhibit D the county records for those filings for the court's comparison. Judge Hale looked at Exhibit D. He looked at the receipt. He set both down. Miss Whitfield, he said, you mentioned in your filing that this is not an isolated case. No, Your Honor, it is not. She reached into her document case and produced the State Land Office records. Holt and Associates has filed similar lien claims against 11 properties across 3 Montana counties in the past 2 years. I have records for all 11 here as Exhibit E. Of those 11, I have direct documentation from 6 property owners. 2 have provided sworn affidavits, which are Exhibits F and G. The courtroom was very quiet. Aldridge was on his feet. Your Honor, this hearing concerns the Whitfield property only. A pattern of conduct is relevant to the credibility of the claim before this court, Judge Hale said with the flat finality of someone who had made up his mind about something several minutes ago and was simply allowing the process to reach the same conclusion. Sit down, Mr. Aldridge. Aldridge sat. May kept her voice level. I would also note, Your Honor, that the Office of the State Attorney General has initiated a preliminary review of Holt and Associates' land acquisition activities. She placed the Attorney General's letter on the evidence table. Exhibit H. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Jack, sitting in the gallery behind her, heard his own heartbeat. Greer at the respondent's table had gone the color of old chalk. He leaned toward Aldridge and said something in a low voice that May couldn't hear, but whose general character she could read from the angle of both their heads. Judge Hale looked at the Attorney General's letter for a long moment. Then he looked at Aldridge. Counselor, he said, does your client wish to continue contesting this discharge? Aldridge's polished, unhurried manner had developed cracks in it. He conferred with Greer for 45 seconds. 45 seconds that felt to everyone in the gallery considerably longer. Your Honor, Aldridge said, Holt and Associates is prepared to withdraw the lien filing against the Whitfield property. May heard Jack exhale behind her. I'll require more than a withdrawal, Judge Hale said. I'll require a formal statement of error filed with this court, acknowledging that the 1877 discharge is valid and that no outstanding debt exists against this property. I'll also be forwarding these proceedings in full to the Attorney General's office, along with my own notation that the pattern of filings described in Exhibit E warrants serious review. He looked at Greer directly over Aldridge's head in the specific manner of a man who has decided which person in a room is actually responsible. Mr. Greer, this court will be watching what your company does next very carefully. Greer said nothing. His hands on the table were not entirely still. May stood at the plaintiff's table and kept her face composed and professional until the gavel came down, and then for several seconds after, because the composed professional face was load-bearing and she needed to make sure the structure was sound before she moved. The gavel came down. Case resolved in favor of the plaintiff, Judge Hale said. Court adjourned. She made it to the courthouse steps before her hands started shaking. It was not fear. The fear had been handled, used up, and the preparation burned through in the presentation. It was the release of something she'd been carrying, contracted for months, the specific physical response of a body that had been braced for impact, finally being told it was over. Jack was beside her before she'd fully registered that she'd sat down on the steps. He didn't say anything. He sat down next to her close enough that their shoulders touched and stayed there. Your hands are shaking, he said after a moment. I know. That's all right. I know that too. She looked at her hands. It's not fear. I'm not afraid. I know you're not. I'm... She stopped. Tried again. I'm angry still. About the three who already settled. Francis Albright and the Garfields and Helena Voss. This was a win. But the three who settled before, I found them. The Attorney General referral changes that, Jack said. If the review finds fraud, and based on what you put in front of that judge today, there's a path to recovery for every settled case. May looked at him. You don't know that. No. But I believe it. He held her gaze steadily. You gave them the best chance they could have had. You did that. May looked down at her hands, which were steadying. Orville is going to be insufferable about this, she said. Jack laughed, the involuntary, genuine kind. He's going to say, of course, and go fix a fence, and that's going to be worse than if he celebrated. It absolutely will be, May said. And she was smiling now, the full version, and the smile was tired and bright at the same time, the way that things are after you've carried them a long way and finally set them down. They sat on the courthouse steps in the October cold for a while longer, shoulders touching, neither of them moving. Around them, Ridgeback went about its afternoon horses at the hitching posts. The sound of the mercantile door, someone's child running across the road, and they were in the middle of all of it, and entirely separate from it. May, Jack said. Yes. October is finished. She had known it was coming, had known since the gavel fell that the 6 weeks were up, and the one remaining question was now simply a question of how. She had spent 3 weeks pretending not to think about it, and thinking about almost nothing else. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with the steady, serious attention he brought to things that mattered, and there was nothing in his face that she hadn't seen building there for 9 months. No surprise, no hesitation. Just the clear and simple weight of something that had been true for a long time and was finally going to be said. I've been thinking about this for a while, he said. How to say it. I had a version that was more polished, and I've lost it somewhere, so I'm going to say the plain one. He paused. I love you, May. I've known it since the squash, probably. I might have known it since the chicken. I'm not going to admit to the chicken I have some dignity left. Her breath caught somewhere between a laugh and something more serious. I want to marry you. Not because of the property, not because of the water rights, not because it makes practical sense in every way that it does. He looked at her without flinching. Because I look for your light in the morning, and I set a second cup out and I don't put it away. Because you're the person I want to talk to when something goes wrong, and the person I want to tell when something goes right. Because you walked into that courtroom today with 11 exhibits and a letter from the Attorney General, and took Holt and Associates apart piece by piece, and I was sitting in that gallery thinking I have never in my life been so completely certain of anything. May looked at him. Her chest was doing the thing she had very limited control over, and she was not trying to control it anymore. That was the polished version, she said. The plain one was worse, he said. Jack? May. The answer, she said, is yes. It has been yes for quite some time. He let out a breath that had apparently been residing in him since at least the Harvest Social. However, she said, his expression shifted with instant reflexive wariness, and she felt the laugh come up before she could catch it, genuine, delighted, fully her own. I want it in writing, she said. The proposal. The agreement. Her eyes were bright. Terms to be negotiated. Water rights remain individually held. Fence maintenance shared equally. Property boundary. May. To be reviewed annually. May. And the squash, she said, stays on my side of the line. He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has just understood that this is what the rest of his life is going to be like, and has no objection whatsoever. The squash stays on your side, he agreed. Everything else we can negotiate. In writing, she said. In writing, he agreed, with a witness. Orville, she said immediately. God help me, Jack said. Yes, Orville. She was still smiling when he reached over and took her hand. Not cautiously, not tentatively, but with the simple certainty of someone who has made a decision and is done waiting to act on it. Her fingers folded against his, and she did not pull away, and the October cold was sharp around them, and neither of them felt it particularly. They sat on the courthouse steps in Ridgeback, Montana, with the case won and the question finally answered, and the whole long winter ahead of them, and both of them thought without saying it, because some things don't need to be said, that this was exactly where they were supposed to be. The chicken, had it been present, would have found somewhere to dig. Orville said, "Of course," and went to fix a fence. Jack had predicted this exactly, and May had laughed when it happened, which was the first time she had laughed in her own kitchen without any particular reason, except that she was happy, and the happiness needed somewhere to go. Orville had listened to the full account of the hearing. The 11 exhibits, the Attorney General's letter, Greer's face going the color of old chalk, Judge Hale's gavel, with his characteristic silence. And then he had said, "Of course," in the tone of a man who had never doubted the outcome for a single moment. And then he had picked up his tools and walked out to the east fence line. He had also, May noticed, shaken Jack's hand before he left, firmly once without ceremony, which from Orville was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Jack came for supper that evening. Not because either of them planned it, he simply didn't leave after they'd finished going through the post-hearing paperwork, and May didn't ask him to, and at some point she put a pot on the stove and set 2 plates on the table, and that was that. They ate together in the easy quiet that had become their natural register, and talked about the Attorney General's review and the 3 settled properties and what the winter herd rotation would look like. And at no point did either of them remark on the fact that this was the first supper they had eaten together in this kitchen, or that it felt entirely like something that had been happening for years. "We should tell people," Jack said at some point over coffee. "Clara Marsh already knows," May said. "How?" "She always knows. It's a gift she has." May wrapped her hands around her cup. "The rest of the town will know by Thursday. Ridgeback runs on Clara's information network and always has. Is there something we should do formally, before Thursday?" May looked at him across the table. "Are you asking whether we should announce an engagement?" "I'm asking whether there's a step I'm missing," Jack said carefully. "Given that I proposed on courthouse steps without a ring, and you accepted while negotiating squash rights. Those are not mutually exclusive events." "No, but I want to do this right, May." His voice was quiet and direct, the tone she had come to associate with the things he meant most completely. "I want to do every part of this right." May looked at him for a long moment. "You already are," she said. Simply without ornamentation, the way she said the things that were entirely true. "You have been for months." The silence that followed was the warmest one they'd ever shared. The engagement was announced in the Ridgeback sense of such things, which meant that Clara Marsh mentioned it to 4 people at the Mercantile on the Wednesday morning, and by Thursday noon, every household within 20 miles knew. The responses ranged from delighted Clara herself, Frances Albright, when she heard the Garfields in a warm letter from Carbon County, to the particular variety of retrospective certainty that small towns always produce, in which everyone suddenly recalled having seen this coming from the very beginning, and were simply waiting for the principals to catch up. Len Pratt, who had said May was overextending with the cattle, and that someone needed to tell her when she was making a mistake, was notably quiet on the subject. This was noted by several people and savored privately by Jack, who said nothing about it, and smiled when he thought no one was looking. Thomas Reed. The young homesteader May had reached before he settled with Holt, and associates rode over to offer his congratulations in person. He was 24 years old, and earnest in the way that people are, when life has recently demonstrated that it can go either direction, and they're grateful it went the right one. He shook Jack's hand and told May that she had saved his property, and he didn't have words adequate for what that meant. And May told him that what would make it adequate was for him to keep good records and know his rights before he needed them, and he nodded like a man memorizing something important. When he left, Jack said, "You're teaching people now." "I'm telling them what my father told me," May said. "It's the same thing." "It's not quite the same thing," Jack said. Your father told you. You're telling everyone who'll listen. He paused. That's different. That's larger. May looked out the window for a moment. Someone has to, she said quietly. The Holt and Associates operation worked because people didn't know their rights. Not because they were foolish, because no one had told them. She turned back. I know. I should tell them. Jack looked at her with the expression she had catalogued, now the one that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite awe, and was possibly both distilled into something quieter and more permanent. Have I mentioned, he said, that you are an extraordinary person? Not in those words. I'm mentioning it now. Noted, she said, and her almost smile went all the way. Amen. The Attorney General's review came back in November with the weight of an institution finally paying attention to something that should have been caught earlier. The preliminary findings confirmed what May had built in her 11-exhibit case, a systematic pattern of fraudulent lien filings targeting properties with incomplete discharge documentation concentrated in counties where land values were rising due to railroad corridor speculation. Holt and Associates, specifically, Edmund Greer, and the principals of the land corporation behind him were named in a formal fraud investigation. Marsh and Cole, the law firm, withdrew from representation within a week of the findings becoming public, which was the legal equivalent of a ship abandoning its rats. The 3 properties that had already settled received formal notification that their cases were under review for possible recovery of rights. May read this in a letter from the Attorney General's office at her kitchen table, and felt the clean satisfaction of something complicated arriving at the right destination. Jack was there when she read it. He had taken to being there in the mornings riding over before his own work started ostensibly to discuss the shared fence maintenance schedule or the creek level readings, actually because the morning coffee was better shared and both of them had stopped pretending otherwise. It's not everything, May said, setting the letter down. The recovery process will take time. Some of those settled rights may not come back. But some will, Jack said. Some will, she agreed. And the operation is stopped. No more properties. She looked at the letter again. That matters most. Jack refilled her cup without asking. She accepted it without thanks. Their household language already without a wedding date set. They negotiated the terms of the engagement agreement in November, which was entirely May's idea, and which Jack accepted with the equanimity of a man who has decided that the shape of a life matters less than who you build it with. They sat at her kitchen table, always her kitchen table, the one covered in maps and documents and the ledger her father had kept, and worked through the practical architecture of 2 lives becoming one, without either of them ceasing to be themselves. The properties would remain individually titled. The water rights as agreed at the spring exchange were jointly held on record, and would continue so. Fence maintenance was to be shared, cost split, evenly disputes to be resolved, and here May had paused with her pen and looked at him with a very specific expression, by honest conversation, and not by chicken. Jack had laughed so hard he knocked over his coffee cup. The squash, formally and in writing, was to remain on the Whitfield side of the boundary. Jack signed this clause with the solemn gravity of a man executing an important document, and May witnessed it with equal solemnity. And then they had both looked at the signed paper and started laughing at the same time, and the laughter was the kind that fills a kitchen and doesn't want to stop. This is the strangest engagement agreement in Montana, Jack said. It is also the most airtight, May said. It absolutely is. He looked at the document. Your mother would have approved. May was quiet for a moment. She looked at the shelf where the Blackstone sat worn at the corners, marked in 2 sets of handwriting. She would have liked you, she said. She would have said you were stubborn but educable. High praise, Jack said. From her extremely. He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had on the courthouse steps, simply without ceremony, like something he intended to keep doing for a very long time. She let him. She folded her fingers against his. Outside, the November wind came off the mountains and hit the house, and neither of them minded it. The winter was the quietest and the fullest May had ever known on that property. She had wintered alone for 3 years, and she had not been miserable. She was not a woman made for misery. It required a passivity she didn't possess. But she had been solitary in a way she hadn't fully acknowledged until it stopped being true. Jack came every morning. Sometimes he stayed the full day working alongside her and Orville on the winter maintenance, the fence checks, the herd management. Sometimes he stayed only an hour long enough for coffee and conversation, and the particular quality of company that makes the silence afterward feel inhabited rather than empty. Orville adapted to this with the resigned pragmatism of a man who had long suspected something of this nature was coming and had simply been waiting to adjust his schedule accordingly. He took on the additional fence section on the eastern line without being asked, freeing May for the mornings, and when anyone in town asked him about the engagement he said, "About time," and offered nothing further. Jack's ranch hand, a taciturn man named Ben, who had worked the Callaway property for 6 years, took the news with a single nod and proceeded to voluntarily repair a section of shared fence that had been slightly wrong for 3 seasons. No one asked him to. He simply did it. Orville noticed and nodded, which was their version of a conversation. In December, on a Sunday afternoon when the snow was packed hard on the ground, and the cold had the particular crystalline quality it got before a big storm, Jack arrived at May's door with something in his coat pocket that he had been carrying for 3 weeks. He had been waiting for the right moment, and he had given up on finding the perfect version of it, and decided to find the honest one instead. She was at the kitchen table with a letter from Helena Voss, who had received preliminary word that her settled land rights were under review for recovery. May was writing the response with the focused efficiency of someone conducting her 10th piece of correspondence of the morning, and she looked up when Jack came in and said, "There's coffee," and went back to the letter. He poured coffee. He sat down across from her. He watched her finish the letter, fold it, address it, set it aside. "Helena Voss," he asked. "Good news possibly. The review is moving faster than I expected." She picked up her cup. "What's in your pocket?" Jack looked at her. "How do you know something's in my pocket?" "You've had your hand near it 3 times since you walked in, and you haven't taken your coat off, which you always do when you come in from the cold." She met his eyes. "What is it?" He put it on the table between them. A ring, plain gold, a small inset stone the color of the creek in summer. Not elaborate. Exactly what it was, and nothing extra. May looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. "It was my mother's," Jack said. "She left it to me specifically, not to my father, to me. She told me to give it to someone who deserved it." He paused. "I've been carrying it for 3 weeks because I keep almost doing this, and then losing my nerve." "You don't lose your nerve," May said. "I do with you," he said. "Consistently. You are the only thing in my life that reliably makes me nervous." May looked at the ring on the table. She looked at him. "You've already proposed," she said. "I've already said yes. We have a signed agreement about the squash." "I know. This is the part that comes with the ring." He held her gaze. "May, I know who you are. I know what you've built, and what it cost you, and what you intend to build next. I know you don't need this. You don't need me in the practical sense, and we both know it, and that's part of why I love you." His voice was quiet and entirely level. "I'm not offering you security. I'm offering you a partner, someone who will sit at the table when there's 11 exhibits and a fraud case to build, someone who will carry your mother's squash seeds if the frost comes early, someone who will fight with you about the name of the creek for the rest of our lives." He paused. "And who will lose that argument because I've accepted that's where we're headed." May laughed. Short, genuine, completely undisguised. "The ring," she said. He picked it up and held it across the table to her, and she held out her hand, and he put it on, and it fit, and neither of them made anything of the fact that it fit perfectly, though both of them noticed. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Miller Creek," she said. "Callaway Creek," he said immediately, reflexively, and then caught himself. His mouth curved. "We'll negotiate. In writing," she said. "Obviously," he agreed. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he held hers, and the winter pressed against the windows, and neither of them minded it at all. They married in April. Not a large wedding, neither of them wanted one. And Ridgeback being what it was, the entire town came anyway, which meant it was large, regardless of intention. The Grange Hall was full. Clara Marsh cried with the specific satisfaction of a woman who had seen this coming before the principals did. Orville stood in the front row and said nothing, which was as always the loudest thing in the room. Ben stood beside Orville and nodded once at the ceremony, with the expression of a man who has had his opinions confirmed by events and considers this adequate. Frances Albright attended riding in from the next county. Helena Voss sent a letter that arrived the day before full of warmth and the news that her land rights had been formally restored by the Attorney General's ruling 2 weeks prior. Thomas Reed was there, standing in the back with his hat in his hands, grinning with the uncomplicated joy of someone who understands that good things happening to good people is not a coincidence, but a consequence. May wore her good dress. She had not bought a new one. She saw no reason to. The dress had been at the Harvest Social, and she thought that was the right dress for continuity, because this had started there really with that particular September night, and those particular words. And it seemed right to wear the same dress to the thing those words had built. Jack saw her across the Grange Hall and stood entirely still for a moment, and several people near him noticed and did not remark on it out of the particular decency that good communities sometimes manage. The ceremony was short and direct. Judge Hale, who had presided over the Holt and Associates hearing, and who had apparently developed a fondness for May Whitfield that he expressed through the brisk efficiency of a man doing something he considers worth doing well officiated. He read the vows, they spoke them, and when he pronounced them married, he added in a dry undertone that only the front row heard clearly, "Try to stay out of my courtroom." May said, "No promises, Your Honor." Judge Hale almost smiled. The first summer of their marriage was the most productive either of their properties had seen in years, which Jack said was coincidence, and May said was predictable, and they argued about it pleasantly for most of June. The herd was healthy on both sides of the shared fence line. The squash, May's mother's squash, came up on the correct side of the boundary, in such abundance that she had more seed than she could use, and began giving portions to other women in the valley, tucked inside letters that explained the variety and its provenance. A small chain of continuity extending outward from one woman's kitchen garden in Ohio in 1862. The creek ran well through the summer. They checked it together, both of them, 3 times a week. Not because either of them needed to, but because it had become their habit the morning walk to the bank, the water level notation in the shared ledger, the conversation that happened alongside the practical task. It was the most ordinary thing. It was also the thing they both separately counted on without saying so. In August, the Attorney General's office completed its formal action against Holt and Associates. Greer was convicted of fraud on 8 counts. The land corporation was dissolved. Of the 11 affected properties, 7 achieved full recovery of any settled rights. The other 4 had complications that the law couldn't fully reach, which May acknowledged, and carried with the particular weight of incomplete things, not guilt, because she had done everything that could be done, but a kind of ongoing attention, a refusal to let those 4 cases become simply a number. She wrote to all 4 families. She told them what had been recovered and what hadn't, and why. She told them what their ongoing options were under the law. She told them she was sorry the system had not moved faster. She signed each letter with her married name, May Calloway, and felt the name both new and entirely natural, at the same time, the way the right things feel when you finally arrive at them. Jack read the letters before she sent them. He didn't suggest changes. He handed them back and said, "These are exactly right." She sent them the next morning. The chicken died in September of that year, peacefully as chickens go, found one morning in the coop, having apparently decided its work was done. May stood over it for a moment with an expression that Orville later described accurately as a woman attending a memorial service for something that had mattered more than she intended. She told Jack that evening. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That chicken started everything." "It started the argument," May said. "We were already neighbors. It started me coming to your door." You came to my door because it crossed onto your property. I came to your door, Jack said, because I wanted a reason to. The chicken provided one. He paused. I should have thanked it. May looked at him. Don't be sentimental about a chicken, Jack. I'm being factual, he said. Sentiment is incidental. She almost laughed. He saw it and pulled it toward him with a look, and she gave up and laughed properly, and he smiled the way he smiled when he had gotten the full version of her laugh, which was the version he loved best. We'll get another one, May said. Another one won't be the same. No, she agreed. But it'll be ours. He looked at her. Ours, he repeated, and the word in his voice was not casual. Ours, she said. In December, a year after Jack had put his mother's ring on May's hand across a kitchen table, with a letter from Helena Voss on one side, and the black stone on the shelf above, May sat at that same table and wrote in the margin of her father's land ledger below his handwriting, alongside her own notations, in the space that remained a single line. She wrote the date. She wrote 2 names. She wrote the word together. Jack found it that evening leafing through the ledger for the creek measurement records. He stopped at the page. He read the line. He stood there with the ledger open in his hands for a long moment, and May, watching from across the kitchen, said nothing. He closed the ledger carefully and set it back on the shelf beside the Blackstone, where it had always lived, and he turned and looked at her across the kitchen with the full weight of everything they had built in his face. The fence line and the survey and the water rights and the courtroom and the courthouse steps and the ring on her hand and the squash and the creek and the first cup of coffee and the second cup that she had set out and not put away until it was cold. He crossed the kitchen. He sat down beside her. He took her hand. Outside, the December cold pressed against the house, and the cattle were settled, and Orville had gone home to his own fire, and the Whitfield land and the Callaway land lay quiet under the same sky, divided by an 11-foot corrected fence line, and joined by everything that mattered. It had started with a chicken and a boundary dispute, and a woman who didn't apologize, and a man who came back anyway. It had moved through surveys and water rights and fraud cases and harvest socials and courthouse steps and a ring that fit and a ceremony that Judge Hale had called worth doing well. It had arrived here, this kitchen, this table, this ledger with 2 names and 1 word in the margin, and here was exactly right. May Callaway had always known the difference between the wrong boundary and the right one. She had spent her whole adult life finding the correct line, fixing what was off-putting things where they actually belonged. This, Jack's hand in hers, the ledger on the shelf, her mother's squash seeds, in jars on the windowsill, the second cup that was never put away again, this was where everything belonged. And it had been worth every inch of the 11 feet it took to get here.